Hey everybody, welcome back to Communication Studies class, Public Speaking Edition. Miss Mang here. Today we are going to talk about argumentation. So we'll be discussing critical thinking and logical fallacies. Buckle up, because this one's a doozy. All right, let's jump right in. First, what is critical thinking? Critical thinking is just making reasoned judgments. Before I explain how to engage in critical thinking, we first need to differentiate listening and hearing. The difference between listening and hearing is when sound waves reverberate against your eardrums. Listening is when you assign meaning to those sounds that enter into your ears. So for instance, a deaf person cannot hear, but they are still able to listen because they assign meaning to messages that they are communicated. Now that we understand the difference between listening and hearing, we need to know that in order to be critical thinkers, we need to be listening to information. And next, we can jump into these 4 steps for critical thinking. The first step for critical thinking is analysis. And what this means is you are going to parse out the message that you have received and really go into great detail to really understand what is the message that is being sent to me. So you would imagine like a jigsaw puzzle. If it was put together, if you were analyzing the jigsaw puzzle, you would take the entire jigsaw puzzle apart and look at each of the pieces. The next step for critical thinking is evaluation. In evaluation, what you're doing is you are evaluating the different arguments that are being made, and you're seeing if these various arguments have validity to them. So in analysis, you've broken apart all of the message into these different parts, and then in evaluation, you're going to pick up the different parts and see if they are valid, each on their own. The next step for critical thinking is interpretation, and this is where you are assigning meaning and explaining the interpretation that you are receiving from this message. So you've parsed out the whole message, you've evaluated whether their claims are logical or valid, and next you will be interpreting or explaining the meaning that you derive from the message that you received. The final step is self-regulation. In self-regulation, you are really examining to make sure that your preconceived notions or your biases are removed from your interpretation. You want to make sure that if you're wearing rose-colored glasses, for instance, that you take those glasses off. You want to make sure that your interpretation of the message isn't muddled by what you believed previously before you began critically thinking about this particular message. Now, you can critically think about anything. You can critically think about a message that someone gives you, about a book that you have read, about an article, or about things that you see on the news. And you can apply this 4-step process across the board. All right, now that we understand what critical thinking is, let's jump into reasoning. There are 2 main types of reasoning: deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Let's first talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning can be explained like a funnel. You have all of these ideas going into a funnel, and from that funnel you derive one singular claim. Now, the idea of deductive reasoning is that if all of the claims that you put into that funnel are true, then the answer, or the final claim that is made from all of those claims together, must be true. Now, one type of deductive reasoning is a syllogism. A syllogism is when you have multiple claims and then they derive a final claim. One syllogism that you might have heard in the past is, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, whereas this makes a lot of sense in this particular instance, when you apply this same argumentation to other arguments, there ends up being some issues. For example, if you were to say, all potatoes have skin, I have skin, therefore I am a potato, that's not exactly accurate logic, but it's following the syllogism format. Deductive reasoning argues that multiple premises can be put together to reach a conclusion that is logically accurate. However, sometimes this doesn't necessarily work. Now let's talk about inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is moving from the specific to the general. So in inductive reasoning, you are taking one idea and you are then applying it to all. Scholars have argued that inductive reasoning, it's not necessarily that the truth of one premise will confirm the truth of the conclusion, but rather the truth of the premise lends support to the possibility of truth for the conclusion. Now, there are a lot of issues with inductive reasoning. Maybe you can think of some of them. So here's an example of inductive reasoning. On January 14th, it was cold in Siberia. Therefore, I can assume that Januaries in general are going to be cold in Siberia. While that may be true for that one instance, here's where it could get to be a little bit more dicey. I have a professor who has blue hair. Therefore, all professors must have blue hair. Not true, right? Right. So you have to be really careful with inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning particularly is where a lot of racism can come from, a lot of stereotypes. Someone has one experience with one person and then they believe that that is true about all the people that have the characteristics of that individual person. This is a type of reasoning that we should be very careful of. In short, with deductive reasoning, you're arguing from a general principle to a specific case. And with inductive reasoning, you're arguing from a specific case and then applying it more generally. So now that we understand the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning, it's important to talk about fallacies. Now, before we get going, you might be wondering, why do I need to know these fallacies? The reason to know these fallacies is we study these fallacies so that we can avoid them. We do not want to be making fallacies in our argumentation, especially when we are speaking in front of a group. When we are speaking in front of a group, we have this credibility just naturally by standing in front of them. And while we are speaking, if we are making fallacies, not only will people probably see those fallacies and not give any more credibility to what we're saying, but also we have the potential, if they don't see the fallacies, to lead the people in the audience into believing that something that is not true is true. So we have to be really careful because we have a responsibility as speakers to be ethical and to present ourselves in a way where our arguments are valid. When we find these fallacies in deductive reasoning, it's going to completely invalidate the entire argument. When we find fallacies in inductive reasoning, it's simply going to weaken the argument. It doesn't necessarily invalidate it. Now, there are two different types of fallacies. There are formal fallacies and informal fallacies. And underneath formal and informal, there are many different specific types of fallacies. So let's first jump into formal fallacies. A formal fallacy is an error in the structure of the argument. The first type of formal fallacy is the bad reasons fallacy. In the bad reasons fallacy, essentially what's happening is you are coming up with a bad reason for whatever argument you're making. For example, we should hire Jill because she has an orange tree. It's like that's a bad reason to hire Jill. Like, yeah, you may think like, oh, we might get oranges if she brings them in, but that doesn't necessarily qualify her to be a good hairstylist. Bad reasons fallacy is easy to remember because the definition is essentially in the name of the actual fallacy. The next formal fallacy is the masked man fallacy. The masked man fallacy is when you substitute parties based on general characteristics. For example, if I saw someone stealing my car and I saw that it was a red-haired woman, and there's a woman and her name is Ginny and she has red hair, and then I tell the police that Ginny stole my car, that is a substitution of parties. I don't necessarily know that it was Ginny. I just know that it was someone with red hair. And so that would be an example of the masked man fallacy. The next fallacy is the fallacy of quantitative logic. And this is when you use the words all or none instead of some. So you are assuming truth of everyone when that's not necessarily the case. For example, making the assumption that all grilled cheese sandwiches taste good. Most grilled cheese sandwiches taste good, but what if someone burns the grilled cheese sandwich and also uses gross cheese and leaves it out for 3 days? Then that grilled cheese sandwich is not good. So the statement that you made that all grilled cheese sandwiches are good is not valid because you use the word all. So if you had said most grilled cheese sandwiches are good, then you would be correct. And you would be avoiding the fallacy of quantitative logic. Now that we've discussed the formal fallacies, let's dive into the informal fallacies. Now, whereas formal fallacies are an error in the structure of the argument, informal fallacies are an error in logic. The first informal fallacy is a fallacy by accident. This is when you take a statement that is generally true and you apply it to an outlier. So for example, dogs make good pets. Coyotes are dogs, so coyotes make good pets. Now in general, dogs do make good pets, but a coyote just so happens to be like the one dog that would not make a good pet and you should not adopt one. And so you just made a fallacy by accident. The next informal fallacy is an ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem fallacy is when you attack the individual who is making the argument instead of attacking the argument itself. So if I was to say, doing your homework will help you get a good grade on the test, and you said, Miss Mang, you're ugly, that would be an ad hominem fallacy. Anytime you are attacking the person instead of the argument itself, that is ad hominem. The next fallacy that we are going to talk about is an appeal to authority. So with an appeal to authority, you're essentially being given the argument that because someone is famous or has notoriety, then you should believe whatever it is that they say. So have you ever seen celebrities advocating credit cards or advocating random products in the marketplace? They're making the argument that we should sign up for that credit card or buy that product because that famous celebrity advocates for it. But this is a logical fallacy. Just because they're famous doesn't necessarily mean that they know the best credit card that we should sign up for. The next fallacy is an appeal to ignorance. This is when the argumentation is made that the proposition must be true unless it can be proved otherwise. This logical fallacy is when we believe a certain argument because no one has necessarily disproven it. This is what people, before we discovered that the earth was round, this is how they argued. So the earth is flat because nobody's proven that it isn't flat. Next is appeal to pity. This is when the speaker will make the audience feel bad for them. So say I was to propose to someone and say, hey, I know we don't really love each other, but I really need to get married or else my parents are going to kill me. Like, my mom's gonna be so disappointed if we don't just get married already. You're making the argument that they should marry you because they feel bad for you. This is definitely not ethical. Next is begging the question. You might also know of this as circular reasoning. So this is when your conclusion is part of the original premise. For example, if I was to say to you, paranormal activity exists because I have experienced things that could only be explained by paranormal activity. That's a circular argument, and it's begging the question. Next is a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is when I provide you with two solutions and they are either ends of an extreme. It's either you're for us or you're against us. In a false dichotomy, you're making the argument that there is no in-between option, that there's only these two extreme options, and you're forcing the other person to decide between these two, when in reality, there is a large amount of options in between that person could choose from. An example of the false dichotomy fallacy is you can either come to this party with me or you can be bored at home. Now, when it's stated that way, it seems like, oh yeah, I guess I do have to go to the party because if not, I will be bored at home. But in reality, you could go to the movies by yourself. You could hang out with your other friends. You could be entertained at home. All of these options that exist that aren't presented with the original argument. Next is the composition fallacy. The composition fallacy is the argument that if all of the parts that make up an argument have a certain quality, then the end result of all of those parts combined will have that same quality. Now here's the thing. This is a problem because let's imagine that we put together like an all-star sports team. So we put Serena Williams, we put Michael Jordan, we put Michael Phelps, we put Mia Hamm, we put all of these people on a basketball team. And we say, okay, you're all the best. You're so good at your individual sports. So if we put you together, you should be the ultimate team. You should be great. You should beat everyone at basketball. But that's not the case because all of their things are good individually, but not necessarily in a group together. And that's a composition fallacy. Now, the opposite to the composition fallacy is the division fallacy. And that's the argument that if something, the conclusion is very, very good, then if you break it apart, all the pieces are going to be just as good. Now, I want you to think of a cake. Cakes are delicious, and I love cake. But if you split up all the ingredients from cake and you just served them all to people, people would not be stoked. Like, no one's going to be like, yum, this flour and this like baking soda, delicious. Let me wash that down with a raw egg. Division fallacy. So composition, all the great parts do not necessarily equal the awesome ending that you're expecting, and division fallacy, this awesome thing that you found cannot necessarily be divided into equally wonderful parts. Next is the false cause fallacy. False cause is when you argue that something is the cause to something else that is incorrect. An example of false cause would be every time I go to sleep, the sun goes down. You going to sleep is not making the sun go down, even if that is correlating. You have to make sure that you're differentiating between correlation and causation. And that mix-up between those two is what creates the false cause logical fallacy. Next is red herring fallacy. Red herring is when you pick something completely irrelevant to say as a method of distraction. So if I was in an argument and someone was saying, hey, you should do the dishes, and then I say, wow, it's so sunny outside. It's like that has no bearing on the argument, but I'm just trying to distract from what's actually happening so that I don't have to do the dishes. Because who likes doing the dishes? The next one is slippery slope fallacy. This is when the argument is made that because of one action, then another action is going to happen, and it's going to become this big snowball effect. So when you assume that one action is going to cause a chain of events that ends in this horrible ending or this other action that happens or consequence that happens later on down the road. Slippery slope would be like if you said, Miss Mang, you have to accept my late work. If you don't accept my late work, then my parents will find out. And when my parents find out, they will kick me out of my house, and then I will inevitably lose my job because I won't have access to a place that I can be clean and eat good food, and then I will end up on the streets, and that's all because of you, Miss Mang. Slippery slope fallacy. Next is a strawman fallacy. A strawman fallacy is when you make an argument that is related to the original claim, but is not the original claim. So think about it like strawman, scarecrow. Scarecrows are strawmen, right? So a scarecrow is meant to replicate a human, but it's not an actual human. So it would be like making an argument towards the scarecrow instead of towards the actual human. So now think of it in argumentation terms. You make an argument, and then instead of me responding to your argument, I respond to the argument's scarecrow. An example of a strawman argument would be if I said, the winter musical at my child's school should include songs that are not necessarily Christmas songs. And then if someone responded to me and what they said was, you won't be happy until no Christmas songs are being played on the radio at all. Now, they didn't actually respond to my original claim that we should include some extra songs in the winter musicale. They just made a leap and generalized and made an argument about something similar, but not necessarily the actual claim. Finally is the fallacy of false analogy. This is when there is a poor connection between two ideas. For example, Mary and Joan both drive trucks. Mary is a teacher. Therefore, Joan must be a teacher too. So you're essentially saying that A and B have similar characteristics of X, and so since they have similar characteristics, then they must share other similar characteristics as well. But that is a false analogy. Thanks for watching this episode of Communication Studies with Miss Mang, and I will see you next time.